Hey, I'm Dan Thomas, and this is my channel for the Newbie Woodworker. Or anyone, really. A while back, I bought these storage bin cases from Harbor Freight. They were on sale, and they're pretty useful. They have different size bins, and you can swap the bins from case to case. I wanted to build a cabinet on wheels for them to go under my shop cabinet. I considered something like this, quite a bit smaller of course, but all those shelves use a lot of wood. Or something like this, using rails instead of shelves, but it still uses a lot of wood for the sides. And since this is the channel for newbie woodworkers, those are more complicated than I wanted to make anyway. So instead, I came up with this cabinet, which is so simple just about anyone can make it. No fancy joinery, no special techniques. Just scrap wood and screws. And a lot less wood because it doesn't even have sides or a back. I put wheels on it so I can store it under my shop cabinet and roll it out when I need it. And it gives me a place to put the case when I open it. And when I'm done, it rolls back out of the way. Well, mostly out of the way anyway. So stick around, and I'll show you how I designed and built it on the fly. The first thing I needed to do was figure out how tall to make the posts. I figured I had about 41 or 42 inches under my shop cabinet, so I called it 41.5. To keep things rolling along, I bought these 3-inch heavy-duty casters. The cabinet could get fairly heavy if I filled all the cases, and since my floor has tiles with raised circles, I wanted to make sure the wheels wouldn't have any issues. The total height of the wheels is about 4 inches. The bottom was going to be 3/4 inch plywood, same as the top. So, if we start out with 41.5 inches, then subtract the thickness of the top and the bottom, and the height of the wheels, it means the posts should be about 36 inches. I had some scrap 2x6s lying around, and I was thinking I'd split them for the 4 frame posts. If you don't have 2x6s, you can just use 2x4s, but don't split them. Since the shorter one is 36 inches long, that worked out perfectly. 2x6s are actually about 1.5 inches by 5.5 inches, so when I split them, they were more like 1.5 inches by 2 3/4 inches, give or take. No need to be exact here. Once I had them split, I needed to cut the longer ones to match the shorter ones. If you can't do this on your table saw, you can use a circular saw, but try and get the lengths as close as possible. For the table saw, I used the shorter one to tell me where to cut the longer one. I butted the shorter one up against the blade, and I used the fence to get the end of the longer one even with the shorter one. But don't leave the fence touching the wood, because when you're making a crosscut, that can cause kickback. I'm using a miter gauge here instead of one of my crosscut sleds, because the pieces are too long for the sleds. My camera battery died right about here, but here's the results. 4 pieces the same length. Next up were the rails. The cases have these flanges that stick down on the sides, and that's what rides on the rails. You might think the wood wouldn't be slick enough, but it worked just fine. I cut the rails from some scrap 3/4 inch plywood I had lying around from a previous project. I made the rails 15 inches long, which is plenty long enough for the cases that are about 12.5 inches. As I said before, don't use your fence for crosscuts, but I am using a stop block against the fence so I can cut everything to the same size. The important thing here is that when the stock hits the blade, it's not touching the stop block at the same time. If it were, there'd be a big chance for kickback. I'm using a crosscut sled here, but I could have used a miter gauge. I prefer using a crosscut sled whenever possible because there's less chance the stock will move side to side, and it just feels like I have better control. You could also use a chop saw or miter saw if you have one. This is my custom crosscut sled that allows me to keep the blade guard on. There's a link to the build video in the description below or on my website. I wanted the rails about 1.5 inches wide for no reason other than it seemed about right. Since the scraps I had were 6 inches wide, I was able to make 4 rails per piece. I didn't bother to make them the exact same width because it didn't really matter. I'll explain why in a moment. I was using my simple push block here, but these 1.5 inch cuts are too narrow to use the push block and keep the blade guard on at the same time, so I had to remove the blade guard. But after I recorded this, I bought this Bench Dog offset push stick, and it would have let me keep the blade guard on. I'll probably be making a special push block for these types of cuts in the future. Since the posts are 36 inches long, I decided to put the cases every 4.5 inches, which divides into 36 nicely, giving me room for 8 cases. I only ended up putting in 7 cases because I wanted some room on the bottom for other stuff. You could probably make them closer together, but this was good enough for me. I need to measure and mark where to put each set of rails, and I want to know where the tops of each set of rails goes. I don't care about the bottoms of the rails. The rails can be different heights for all I care, but the tops need to be level with each other. I know that this is 4.5 inches, and this is 1.5 inches, so that makes the top of the first set of rails at 3 inches. The tops of the rest of the rails are 4.5 inches down from the tops of the previous rails. I hope this makes sense. So I marked where the top of each rail should go, and I double-checked to make sure I got it right. I've messed up things like this way too often. Then I drew lines across all posts at the same time, so they'd be aligned properly. Now I'm getting ready to attach the rails to one side. I used my fence to get the bottoms of the posts aligned. They don't have to be perfect. When I attach the bottom, they'll even out, but they should be close. I attached the top rail first, then I attached the bottom rail. That way, I knew the posts were pretty much the same width apart all the way down. I used 1.5-inch SPAC screws, which are similar to GRK or Torx. I'm drilling countersunk pilot holes first. I didn't bother with glue because these screws hold great, and if there's an issue later on, I can always add glue then. But if I wasn't using this type of screw, then I'd definitely be using glue. I did the other side the same way. The next step was to connect the two sides using strips of plywood that also act as backstops for the cases. My plan was to cut some spacers that kept the sides the right distance apart so the cases could slide in and out, and then clamp them into place. That would let me determine how long to cut the back pieces, and with the clamps still in place, I could attach them. Then I could remove the clamps and spacers, and everything would stay in place. So here's the clamped spacers, and they're the right length to allow the cases to slide without binding. It took some trial and error to get the spacers the right length. You can see I have a little play, but not enough so the cases fall down. So then I cut the back pieces to the right length. And with the spacers still clamped into place, I attached the back pieces. And finally, with the clamps and spacers removed, I slid in all the drawers to make sure they fit. And what do you know, they actually did. All that's left are the top, the bottom, and the casters. The top overhangs a little to give it a little extra room. The bottom is wider, leaving room for the casters and bolts. So I'm cutting the top and bottom now. By the way, I have a couple of Harbor Freight roller stands just off camera to support the outfeed. I'm attaching the bottom first. I lined up the cabinet on the bottom and outlined the legs so I knew where to put the screws. I didn't bother measuring for the pilot holes, I just punched them where I thought they should go. Bad camera angle here, but I hope it's obvious what I'm doing. I used the casters to mark where the holes for the bolts should go. Then I drilled the holes for the 1/4-inch bolts I'll be using. I drilled the holes a little oversized to make sure I can line up the caster holes correctly. And of course my battery died in a moment. Looks like I have one battery that's outlived its usefulness. I decided to attach the top before attaching the casters so it wouldn't be rolling around. Then I flipped it over and started attaching the casters. I'm using 1/4-inch bolts with hex heads that are 1 1/4 inches long, I think, along with a washer, a lock washer, and nut. Apparently I'm a klutz, so there's no point in watching me struggle to do something this simple. Just use your imagination. So here it is. Don't leave just yet, because I've got a couple more tips in just a moment. But before that, let me just say that yes, I know this isn't beautiful, but there's nothing wrong with functional and usable. Don't be afraid to try your hand at things like this, and especially don't be afraid of mistakes. They're the best way to learn. For example, I may decide that I should have used glue. If that happens, guess what? I'll just go back and add glue. Lesson learned. My experience with SPAC screws says this is unlikely, but it's not impossible. So here's some of my cases. This is my machine screws and bolts case. All of these, except for this little bin here, are 1/4-inch threads with 20 threads per inch. It's really easy to find things this size in my neck of the woods, so that's why I standardized on it. I strongly recommend that you pick a size and do the same. Whatever you can find in your area that isn't too big or too small. It makes life a lot easier to not have to scrounge around for the right size nut to go with a bolt. I've also got a bin with carriage bolts in it the same size. I bought way too many of these at one time, and I don't know if I'll ever use them up. Live and learn. Here's my SPAC screws. Looks like I need to hit up Home Depot for some more 1.5-inch ones. I don't use these wafer head screws anymore. Their heads are slightly rounded over in case you wondered what they were. And here's some of my other wood screws, along with hinges and mending plates, stuff like that. I'm not done organizing, and I've still got stuff left in my old organizers. And for those of you who think my shop is too clean, now you know the truth. Hey everyone, thanks for pushing me past the 100,000 subscriber mark. I'm honestly humbled and honored by your support. You have no idea. And I know I haven't been releasing videos as often as I used to, but hopefully that'll start changing from here on out. Keep your fingers crossed. And if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider leaving a comment. Subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to ring that bell to get notified when I release a new video. And lastly, let's be kind to each other, even if we root for different teams.